Good evening. Welcome to Laurie Auditorium and to Trinity University's Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Danny Anderson and I'm the president here at Trinity University. Our Distinguished Lecture Series is made possible by the Walter F. Brown family of San Antonio. I'd ask you to begin the evening by joining me in showing our appreciation for their generosity with a round of applause. This lecture series has a wonderful history of enlivening the cultural and civic landscape in San Antonio by bringing national and international leaders to our campus and to our community. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, just a few housekeeping announcements. Please take a moment to silence your phones or mobile devices. Make sure I've done that. After the talk, there will be time for a few questions. Trinity students may use the microphone stage right, and guests may use the microphone stage left. Please ask brief questions rather than sharing your own ideas. We would love to hear from our speaker. Also, please be aware that we will only have time to take the first few questions at each microphone, and I will give the signal when we're down to the last few questions. Shifting now to our guest, few people have as much insight into the current state of national and global affairs as General Stan McChrystal. A four-star general with a remarkable record of achievement, he is widely praised for creating a revolution in warfare that fused intelligence with operations. McChrystal is the former commander of U.S. and international forces in Afghanistan and the former leader of Joint Special Operations Command, which oversees the military's most sensitive forces. His leadership is credited with the 2003 capture of Saddam Hussein and the 2006 location and killing of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. The son and grandson of Army officers, McChrystal graduated from West Point in 1976 and was commissioned as an infantry officer. He later trained at the Special Forces School in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and spent much of his career commanding special operations in airborne infantry units. From 2003 to 2008, as head of the Joint Special Operations Command, he was responsible for leading the nation's deployed military counterterrorism efforts around the globe, assuming command of all international forces in Afghanistan in June of 2009. President Obama's order for an additional 30,000 troops to Afghanistan was based on McChrystal's assessment of the war. In 2010, General McChrystal retired from the military and co-founded the McChrystal Group, a global advisory services and leadership development firm. He also today chairs a project called the Service Year Alliance, and this is a program that works to make a year of paid full-time service a common expectation and an opportunity for all young Americans. He is a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, where he teaches a popular course on leadership. So please join me in giving General Stan McChrystal a warm Trinity University welcome.
Thank you, please. If you were standing where I am, you'd know that this is more than a little intimidating. A few years ago, I got to go and speak at Oxford University in Britain. And you know, it's older than our nation. And they've got it down to an art. The speaker gets taken to the political union, and first you walk by old stone and polished wood, and they take you into what they call the green room where they prep, and they basically make you nervous. And they talk about the history of the place where you're going to speak. And then as they walk out to speak, you pass a number of photographs. And on those photographs, the last one is a picture of Teddy Roosevelt speaking exactly where you're about to speak. And it's not subtle. The message is, you are no Teddy Roosevelt. I got it. So I go in and I was nervous. And I start to speak. And as soon as I start to speak, a person in the crowd goes, dead asleep. If you've never had that happen, it is really disconcerting. Because what do? You try to look away from them because you don't want to see that, but you can't help yourself. You keep looking around, and hopefully they'll wake up. So I went through this, and it wasn't until the end of the speech when people were kind enough to applaud that the person woke up. So help me out. The person was my wife, Annie, and she's sitting right there. So somebody give her the elbow, Kim. We're going to talk a little bit about the world tonight. And all of us think a lot about it. Most of us have spent a lifetime involved in it. But we're going to talk about it in a way that hopefully makes us all think, because there's not a single answer. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with something that hopefully doesn't make you uncomfortable. It doesn't make me uncomfortable. It's our national anthem. I'm going to ask everyone, if you feel comfortable, to stand. Please, feel free to sit. There's probably nothing more American than our national anthem, Air Force aircraft flying overhead, and the Super Bowl. We think about how this makes us feel, and we think about how our nation in moments like that. And sometimes, what do we think about? Most of us grew up with the idea that our nation was dominant in the world. There was no nation nearly equal to us. We had a world order based on what came out of the Second World War, the Cold War, our success economically, and now it feels like that order is crumbling. It feels like things have changed. Back in 1991, we had extraordinary success in the first Gulf War, a war that lasted 100 hours. I was there. We started the war, and literally, from the earliest moments, we knew that we would win, and we would win fairly easily. Most of us have lived in a world in which the United States was dominant economically. In 1960, we were 40% of the world's economy. 174 nations, and we're 40% of it. In industry, we think of what our history was. We used to produce 40% of all the steel in the world. That's an extraordinary amount. Now, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where the United States had this unassailable position in the world? Well, it's fun to roll it back a bit. The United States at the beginning of the 20th century was already growing as an economic power. We were not yet a military dominant force, but economically, as the First World War came in, we went into the First World War $4 billion in debt to Europe. When our troops came home in 1918, we were $10 billion owed to us by Europe. in funds at that age. Armistice Day in the United States was a great celebration. We'd lost slightly over 100,000 lives in the war. The forces came home and we'd gone and we'd helped Europe, which we were very wary of, pull themselves together. And we ushered in an era, the United States of the 1920s. It was pretty good times. Economic growth, the stock market went up, production was extraordinary as we began the era of true mass production. Suddenly, people could own cars themselves. But that wasn't true for the other people who were involved in the First World War. Britain, which was one of the winners in the First World War, staggered out economically, now in debt. They'd lost more than 1 million soldiers in the fight. The empire which they had spent a century and a half building was starting to weaken perceptibly. Russia, which had lost its fight in the First World War in 1917, had revolution. The monarchy fell. The Tsar and his family were killed. The Bolsheviks took over in November of 1917 and began the era of the Soviet Union. Progress, but extraordinarily painful for our nation as well. Germany, who had lost the war, of course, came out weakened economically. The Versailles Treaty created extraordinary reparations, forced debt upon Germany, so that the Weimar Republic was extraordinarily weak. Political unrest started. Young upstarts like Adolf Hitler in 1921 started to raise organizations like the Nazi Party. China, which most people didn't pay much attention to, it had a revolution in 1912. And they entered an era of unrest which essentially lasted until after the Communist Revolution in 1949. 20 years later, we have another world war. Many times worse for the world in terms of casualties and loss. But America came home victorious again. Look, American troops coming home in 1945 and 1946, we had won. We had lost more than 400,000 Americans in the war. But when we got back, the industrial base, part of which had been energized by war production, took off. And America, which had not suffered internal damage and had built up an industrial base, became extraordinarily dominant, technologically and economically. It was aberrational in world history for a single nation to have this kind of position. Our allies didn't fare so well. Britain, which had also won the Second World War, limped out of that war, again with high casualties, but also destruction to the physical infrastructure of the nation. And of course, the world empire which it had was beginning to be weakened in its legitimacy. And the movements for independence increased. And so Britain was wobbly from afar and wobbly inside. Most Americans don't realize, but Britain still had rationing until the mid-1950s. The Soviet Union suffered 27 million casualties in the Second World War. We suffered 400,000. 27 million Soviet soldiers and civilians were killed in the fighting. They came out victorious, but much of the nation had been badly damaged. Germany not only lost, it was torn into pieces. The agreement at the end of the Second World War created 4 separate zones. And they were controlled by the victors. China, which had suffered war from 1931 on, went through the war, and then in 1949, the Chinese communists won the fight against the nationalists and took over. And so China entered the communist era in 1949, again with extraordinary damage and loss of life in the period of about 15 years of war before that. If we think about that, we came out of the Second World War. Most of us in this room remember the 1950s and 1960s as we approach what might be called the apogee of American power. And when was that? Maybe it was the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Maybe it was the beginning of our Cold War adversary teetering and then falling, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Maybe it was success in the first Gulf War. We were described, as many of you will remember, as a hyperpower by some people in the world, some with resentment, but with a fair amount of respect as well. But there were the rise of other nations as well. Iran, North Korea, both of which in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, we barely noticed. They were big players compared to the size of their arsenals, and they've grown bigger in our minds since. Think about Korea. Korea was occupied by the Japanese at the beginning of the 20th century. And for about 50 years, the Japanese were hard on the Koreans, extraordinarily hard. There's great resentment today in Korea still about the Japanese occupation. Many Korean forces fought on the Japanese side in the war because they were forced to. In 1945, Korea was split. North Korea and South Korea. Then in 1950, after friction along the border, North Korea invaded South Korea. And we'll remember that the first weeks of the war were extraordinarily painful as the North Koreans pushed all the way down to the Pusan perimeter. In the summer of 1950, it looked as though South Korea might not exist as a nation, and the United Nations forces, which had initially deployed to help, would be run out of Korea. That summer, my father-in-law landed in Korea with the first American tanks. They landed in the Pusan perimeter. They were sent out to the line, and they were told to go forward, just drive up this road until the North Koreans can see that we now have tanks. They didn't even have the radio frequencies to talk to the other American forces. It was so tight, just get there. He went all the way to the Yalu River. And then right before Thanksgiving, 1950, he was pushed all the way back to the 17th parallel. Only officer in his company to survive. It was a bitter war that lasted until the summer of 1953 with no clear winner. And North Korea remains divided to this day. We sort of forget about Iran. Iran, of course, was the ancient empire of Persia. In 1953, they elected a man named Mossadegh to be the prime minister. And then he was overthrown. He was overthrown in Iranian memory with the help of U.S. and British intelligence services. There were disagreements over who owned the oil. He was moving to nationalize the oil industry. He was replaced by the Shah of Iran, the Peacock Kingdom, who was put back in power, and the Shah became a bulwark of stability in the region. And from 1953 until the late 1970s, we considered the Shah of Iran as that client state in the Middle East that would help produce stability. He bought an extraordinary number of American and other Western weapons. He seemed like a stable client, ally. But inside Iran, he was viewed as a dictator. And the Slovakia secret police were viewed as an extraordinarily repressive force. In early 1970 or 1978, he was forced out, you remember, with sickness, and the Ayatollah Khomeini arrived. The Ayatollah came back with the imposition of an Iranian revolutionary government. And from the day he arrived, he was against the West. He would say extraordinary things about the West. And we began to view Iran as an enemy. Just a year before, it had been a trusted ally, and now it was a bitter enemy. Iran did not have an easy time of it. Many Americans were looking the other way when Iraq invaded Iran in 1980. And for all of the 1980s to 1988, Iran and Iraq fought a bitter war. 1 million Iranians were killed. We were really not on either side, although we did provide intelligence to the Iraqis, the government of Saddam Hussein. And so the Iranians built up greater resentment to the United States. And of course, remember in the middle of the 1980s, there were the tanker wars where they were attacking oil tankers. And then the USS Vincennes made a mistake, misidentified a civilian airliner as a hostile threat and shot down an Iranian airliner with 256 people aboard and more than 30 children. It was a mistake, but in the minds of Iranians, it was an act of war. What was in the past, what we grew up with, whether the Cold War was difficult or not, is not going to be the future. The world order has evolved. But where does it take us? What does it mean for us? First thing I would argue we need to think about is the democratization of technology. What do I mean by this? For many years, the technology, which was impressive to us, cyber warfare, global positioning system, artificial intelligence, weapons of mass destruction, they were all things that were owned and controlled by nation states, advanced nation states. The ability to use unmanned aerial vehicles belonged first just to the United States, and now that technology is available not just to other nation states, it's available literally to anyone. In Mosul, fighting against ISIS a couple of years ago, American forces inside the city of Mosul had small drones fly into windows with hand grenades attached and attacked. That's a precision strike weapon. Probably cost about $40. Flown by a person with no particular training. And so suddenly the idea that we used to have long-range missiles, advanced aircraft, the ability to see in the dark, the ability to talk securely, all of that suddenly is available to everyone. And it's got some pretty big implications for us. Suddenly the advantages that we had even a few years ago in Iraq and Afghanistan to see the battle, to communicate, to protect our forces, to do all of those things is at risk. Think about the ability to defend bases and other places that we consider important. Think about a swarm of small, inexpensive drones, all with a small explosive charge, coming at an aircraft carrier, coming at a building, coming at the south lawn of the White House when the president is trying to board a helicopter. Think about trying to stop those kinds of threats with the kind of technology we have right now. There are things being designed to try to do that, but it's a leapfrog of technology that's now democratized. You're not just competing with your Russian enemy or your Chinese enemy, you're competing almost with everyone. And so we talk about potential adversaries. Who do we have to think about? Of course, we have to think about Russia. Undoubtedly, we have to think about China. We need to think about non-state actors. We even need to think about individuals. Now you say, well, we will deter them from attacking us. But the principle of deterrence is based upon your ability to hold your enemy at risk. If you think about nuclear war, In the nuclear age, the entire idea of deterrence was based upon if you strike us, we will have the ability to strike you in a way that you don't think you can stand, and so we deter you from taking action. Even in the days of large fleets and large armies, it was all based on holding your enemy at risk, and therefore they had to do a calculus whether to strike. A non-state actor, a terrorist group or other element, is very difficult to hold at risk. You may not know who they are, where they are, or they may not care. And to hold an individual at risk, particularly an individual willing to die, how do you deter that? How do you convince them don't do this? Because the idea of deterrence is based upon rational actors. And suddenly, if you're dealing with someone who doesn't compute rational actor the same way we do, it's a different calculus. Think about North Korean missile development and testing. We say, well, we're going to tell the North Koreans not to have nuclear weapons. We're going to convince Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons. Why would he do that? I mean, what could we give him? The chances are, if he gave up nuclear weapons, he would be overthrown by his own regime. Even if you don't buy that, he certainly watched what happened to Gaddafi after he gave up his nuclear program. And there's a calculus that says the thing that keeps me alive gives me credibility is some kind of disproportionate power that nuclear weapons give me. Now, there's risk in it. There's risk because the United States puts on sanctions, other pressures, and also, if he pushes far enough to get a war, then North Korea is destroyed. But the reality is they've now developed enough capability to make destroying them an expensive proposition, one that we just haven't been willing to pay to date. So if you put yourself in Kim Jong-un's position, why wouldn't he just keep pushing, developing advanced capability, and going just far enough to advance himself, but not incur a counterstrike? Or Iran. Why wouldn't Iran want a nuclear weapon? If you were Iranians, wouldn't you want a nuclear weapon? Probably would. Even if you're fairly liberal, it's a ticket into a club that gets you greater respect. India and Pakistan both got greater respect when they became nuclear. So the reality is, when we stop back and say, well, Iran shouldn't be nuclear, their response is, who died and left you in charge? How do you have the right to tell us we can't have something? And we say, well, you might use it. And they go, well, you're the only person who's ever used it. You're the only country that's ever used it. And so the counter-argument's pretty strong, particularly in a country that's got pride. 80 million Iranians are proud to be Iranians. They are not all aligned with their government in any way. The United States is not even unpopular with a great number of the Iranian population. But if we step back and suddenly make ourselves Iranian, we look at recent history, look at their place in the world, why wouldn't they want that? I think we have to worry about this guy. You know, 20 years ago, we would have said, we don't have to worry about him, or Russia. But in the short term, he's playing a strong hand. Think about it. At the end of the 1980s, when Russia collapsed in 1991, they were at a point of extraordinary humiliation. Vladimir Putin was an intelligence officer, and he had been a part of a very proud entity in the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the Soviet Union is no more. Russia is bankrupt, and the West is telling them, sorry, tough for you. I mean, think about how you'd feel. Remember, Russian women were going around the world and essentially becoming consorts with people all over the place. Think how humiliating that is for a proud people. Suddenly they're being told they're not a world power. And starting with the invasion of Chechnya, Vladimir Putin started to reassert Russian pride and effectiveness. And he's done it pretty well. In 1973, Henry Kissinger maneuvered Russia out of the Middle East after the '73 war. Now they're back. Now they're in Syria. They're players. They will be involved in whatever settlements happen in Syria, and we probably won't be at the table. So he's playing a pretty strong hand. Now, in the long term, it's not that strong. Russia's got about 145 million people, but their demographics are shrinking. Their population will go down over time. So the reality is he has a decreasing power base. And of course, it's an oil-based economy to a great degree. And as we transition to other kinds of energy, there's every likelihood that Russia will either have to change very rapidly or be behind. Russia's also got a very corrupt government, a very corrupt dictatorial government. And in the short term, that tends to work well. In the long term, historically, more pluralistic democratic regimes do well. But that's the long term. And you know, in the long term, we'll all be dead. Now think about China. For most of our lives, we'd say China actually had a pretty weak hand. They had a whole ton of people, but they were way behind us technologically. They were way behind us in many areas. Well, they are coming on, and they're coming on fast. Very focused population, very focused economic policies. President for life. Not much of an election cycle there. So their hand's really not weak anymore. And in the long term, you could argue that they have an extraordinarily strong hand. A great position geographically in the world, great potential economically in the world. But I would say I'd put a question mark on that, because China also has some inherent weaknesses. The nature of the regime, the pressure of population, the number of new jobs they got to create every day. They have to be an export and import economy or it doesn't work. And so they've got some vulnerabilities over the long term that I think we need to understand. We may not be able to do anything about them directly, but we need to understand and take those into account. So what do we do about it? I think everybody probably has an opinion. I'll tell you what I think we do. We invest. What do we invest in? First and foremost, I think we invest in people. We invest in the things that makes a society and economy work. That's the talent of our people. That's the education of our young people. That's the skills of our workers in industries that are changing. We invest in infrastructure. Fly overseas and go into an airport in many third world countries and you'll be embarrassed by what you see in many American airports. They just opened a new airport in China that's extraordinary. We have bridges falling down. We have roads that need work. Those things all feed our economy. One of the great leap forward in the American economy and productivity in the 1950s was the interstate highway system. Suddenly we could move things more cheaply, faster. Infrastructure's key. I think we invest in a modern economy. The world is going to electric vehicles. That's not a news flash to any of us. It is going there. The people who make the best ones first, establish the market, are going to do very well. The people who sell yesterday's technology are not going to do very well. And so we need to think about the modern economy in every aspect and get out in front of it. Sometimes that's painful because you dislocate things we like, we're comfortable with, that are expensive. But we're in a global economy now. We're not competing with other states in the Union. We're competing in the world. We invest in relationships. This is not a world when single nations are going to do very well. The great danger for places like North Korea and even Iran is our isolation. One of the great strengths we had for many decades was a web of relationships where people would do things for and with the United States because we maintained a relationship with them. When I commanded in Afghanistan as a NATO commander, there were 46 nations in the coalition. Now you can imagine that made it kind of hard to coordinate things. And there were times when people say, well, Americans are doing all the heavy lifting. Well, when I did a look at the numbers, and I looked at casualty rates per capita, the highest casualty rate was Estonia. They were losing more soldiers per capita than we were. And many of those countries were in Afghanistan not because they had anything to gain from it, except that America asked them to come. We asked them to come and be part of a coalition. Many at great political risk internally to do that, but the relationship with America was so important, they said, we have got to do that. But there's a time you're going to need friends, everybody. And I think the years in the future are going to be one of those times. So I think we invest in relationships. Things are changing. I don't think we waste our time trying to deny that. We don't waste our time trying to bring back yesterday or the last decade. There's really no point in mourning it, okay? It's gone. And there's certainly no value in complaining about it. Why isn't it like it used to be? Well, it's not. So what do? You do what Americans do well. You compete. You step up. You get on the field. You take every bit of talent we have, every kind of person in our nation. I'd be honored to take any questions you might have. Thank you. Student Mike, you're up.
Good evening, General McChrystal. This actually isn't a question, but I served under you in Afghanistan.
God bless you. Thanks for doing that.
And you actually called me on my birthday. It was...
when you turned 13, right?
30, yes. But you worked with my brother up in Kabul, and this was day 2 of Operation Moss Track, and I was missing my family, but you called and didn't take you seriously at first, but you kind of relit my flame because of everything that we were doing, and so I just wanted to say thank you.
You are so kind, and thanks for your service, and thank your brother. Is he okay?
He's great.
Perfect.
General,
my
name is Peter Thompson. I'm a Trinity alumni,
Yes, sir.
and I'm also a West Pointer. In the 1960s, I was in special ops in the Army. And I'd like to know from you how the integration went of Army Special Ops, Navy Special Ops SEALs, Air Force Air Commandos, Marine Recon. You did that. You helped integrate these extremely different units. What have you produced, and how good are they?
Well, first off, they are amazing. They've always been amazing personally, as you know. The individual's always been that. But what we had a series of silos. If JSOC was formed in 1981 after the failure of the Iran mission, and they took part of American Special Ops, they took Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the Rangers, Night Stalkers, and they put them together. And the theory was you take the dream team and you put them together and poof, they're going to be wonderful. And that's good in theory. And I grew up in JSOC, and then I become the commander, and what you find is, actually, Delta didn't like the SEALs very much. The SEALs hated Delta, Both of them looked down at the Rangers, and nobody wanted to talk to aviators, because why would you, right? And so what we had was, we didn't have a team of teams, we had a tribe of tribes. Now, in peacetime, we could have never made the change. But what happened is, we had the crucible of combat with a burning platform. We were losing to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And we realized that if we didn't become a network, and we didn't work together, we would lose. And I'd like to say I stood up in front of everybody and with my charisma and power said, do it, and it happened. But that's not quite how it happened. I was in command for 5 years. I was supposed to be in for 2 years. And what we did was we started taking the network, we started putting liaisons from the different organizations together. There was great resistance to that at first. We started forming cross-functional teams with Delta Commander, SEAL Deputy, Ranger, Sergeant Major, and then put them together to force the interaction. And then we went to radical transparency in the force. And what the radical transparency did, we had 17 different task forces in Iraq alone across the country. Every day we did a 90-minute video teleconference with the whole command. And so before you saw your part, you think we're the only people with our act together, everybody else must be screwed up. This video teleconference, you saw what everybody else is doing. You saw the good things, you saw the failures. On the good things, you saw best practices, and you started wanting to do that to be equal. And you also developed empathy, because you'd have a SEAL come up in Afghanistan, he'd be dirty from the night before, maybe some blood on him, and he'd report, sir, we did an operation last night, it didn't go well. And everybody sees that. And suddenly you realize they're having the same problem we are. And somebody texts him across the chat rooms and whatnot and says, hey, we've got something that we think can help. It took a long, long time, but they started to meld together with the idea that nobody's batting average, only the score on the big fight against Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Taliban in Afghanistan counted. So it was a painful process, and then I add in, you got to bring the CIA, the National Security Agency, the FBI, all the other parts in as well, all of whom have a very different culture. And so, yeah, got some people who've been through this. You've got to create the idea that everybody is equal and of the same. And you've got to create a meritocracy where just the biggest person with the biggest shoulders and the best shooter is not, the most important. Because in reality, the most important are people who can make organizations work together. That's more valuable than the shooter or pilot, because that's kind of a commodity. And so that was the journey we took.
And it is working, isn't it?
JSOC is extraordinary now. They have continued on. The rest of the military, there are places where it's better than others. But there's certain muscle memory in a big organization like the whole military.
Thank you, sir.
You're kind, sir. Thank you very much. All right.
Sir, good evening. I'm kind of tall.
Please.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Crystal Blue, Nurse Corps Officer. My question for you, sir, is as our military moves into a multi-domain operation against our near-peer threats, what are your recommendations for myself and my colleagues as we take on increasingly complex leadership challenges while we're trying to bridge a very interesting generational gap?
Yeah. No, that's good luck.
That's why I'm asking you, sir.
Yeah. Here's my opinion, and it's one guy's opinion. The first thing is you've got to admit that this is very complex, and the next war will be completely different from what we expect. Even when we study it with Futures Command and everything, we're going to get it wrong, because every rational actor will look and see what we prepare to do, and they will do something else. Sure. So whatever we do guarantees that's not the war we will fight. So we've got to develop an attitude that says we are going to stumble into the next war sort of half prepared. So how do you prepare? I think you prepare an organization for problem solving and complexity. You don't prepare them to do a single thing well. So the idea of doctrine that says this is how we fight is actually dangerous now, because it starts to convince people that there is a right answer to something, but the question will keep changing. And so I would argue that what you really want is people who aren't constrained by doctrine, that says the doctrine is, if it's stupid and it works, it ain't stupid.
Absolutely.
So what we have to do is develop an entire generation of people who look at these problems in an entirely different way, which I think means a more diverse workforce, not just females and males, but older, younger, people with a completely different background, all put into a military context, because it's not a strictly military fight in the old sense. the next war is going to be won by influencing populations. And we've tried to do that for years with strategic bombing and propaganda. But influencing a side to do or not do something is who wins, I think. Absolutely. And it's going to be done by cyber, it's going to be done by some military operations, it's going to be done by all kinds of things. So how do you understand what will cause somebody to change their intentions? It's going to take an entirely different effort. The one great thing I'd say is the young people that I dealt with then and I deal with now, they want to be given problems. They want to be given, okay, here's a problem, not a set solution looking for a problem. And so I think when you challenge them with that, you'll get a pretty good outcome.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
My pleasure. Ma'am.
Hi, good evening, General. A few years ago, I attended a lecture here at Trinity by Condoleezza Rice. And the thing I remember most about her lecture was she was speaking about failed states, in particular in Mexico. Could you talk a little bit about what countries you see are failed states that are of the greatest risk, the United States?
Yeah. First, I'd say failed states are extraordinarily dangerous to us. And you say, well, wait a minute, that state's a long way away, it doesn't matter. So if Venezuela melts down, kind of what do we care? Well, we do, because failed states are sort of like a virus. And it starts to go because they share their problem around the world. They share with migrants, they share with crime, they share with all the things that emanate from a failed state. The ones that worry me are those where the governance stops working. Venezuela jumps to mind. Big countries that are fairly stable, like Brazil, you've got a big thing, they can get in trouble pretty quickly. It doesn't take much to suddenly, you have a problem. I'm not saying Brazil is anywhere close there, but Venezuela clearly is.
Bolivia's in the news a lot too.
That's exactly right. Then you go further afoot, and of course places like Libya have a tremendous problem. And then places which aren't failed right now, but look at Nigeria. If you look at the population of Nigeria, in 2050, I think the population is going to be 750 million people. Now you go, wait a minute, there is no way Nigeria can support 750 million people. So now you go, you can see that problem coming. And so when we look at those kinds of things, that kind of failed state, the world needs to realize that we have to do something about it. We can't say, we got our problems, you guys, everybody else sort yourself out, because if they don't, we pay for it. And so I think that looking at it that way, and of course, you can even look at places like Italy right now. Run the numbers on Italy. Big problem. Now, very good population, fairly robust industrial base, but the numbers don't work. And so unless they clean up their economy, there's a big problem.
If I could ask just to follow on that, what can the United States do to minimize or buffer its risk from this?
Yeah, I think you've got to do it forward. If you don't do it forward, you'll do it here. And so I think we've got to try to help those states. And you say, wow, we hate foreign aid, we hate putting people out there. But think about health care. You want to save money, do prenatal health care. You want to save money, do early child education and nutrition. If a child isn't reading by age 8, they never catch up. That's the statistic. So the reality is you've got to do those things which are preventative in nature, but aren't popular to do. They aren't fun to do, to put money into that. But I think it's the best investment we can make. And the same as in other countries. Even though it's very frustrating, you'll invest relationship and all to try to improve governance, give an economic output. And in many cases, it may not stick. I think it's still worth a try, because where it does, it makes such a difference. We talked about this earlier tonight with a group of students. People go, why can't it be like the good old days, like World War II? That was clean. We landed on Normandy, we marched across, we took Berlin. Good for us. We didn't do counterinsurgency in World War II. Of course we did. We did it after the war. We did the Marshall Plan. And we predicted, or we prevented all the things that would have happened had Europe continued to sink down. And yet there were people who had doubts about it, but it was probably the best investment we could have ever made. So that's what one person thinks anyway. Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome to San Antonio.
Thank you so much.
General McChrystal, thank you very much and welcome to Military City, USA. And I want to thank this audience for coming out for your program tonight. You and I have been corresponding through the day.
Yes, sir.
And I want to thank you very much for that. But my stick is that the attitude of the public towards military service seems to be drifting apart. I did a radio program called Military City Radio a number of years ago, and I found that people in the military were really anxious to talk about that. And not only that,
Right.
they were hopeful that somebody would grab it and do something about it. And so suicide inside the military is also very high, and I view that as part of the RIF. And so I'd like to ask you, what can the community do to support the United States military so we can perpetuate our way of life?
No, sure. Thanks for John. Thanks for asking, and thanks for the correspondence. Okay, who sends young people to war? You say the military does. No, the military doesn't. The government does. No, the military government doesn't. You do. You ask people to join the military indirectly. You ask them to go to war, whatever it is they do, and you ask them to believe. You ask them to believe in the American dream. You ask them to believe in American values. You ask them to believe in patriotism. And you ask them to believe in a covenant that says, if you go to war for our nation, we'll take care of you. And they believe. They go forward and they do it with extraordinary courage. Now, some of them don't think it through quite like that, but that's what's motivating them. Then they come home. Who's responsible for them? Someone says, well, the military is. No, the military's got stuff to do. You are. Communities are. Same people who went, who sent them. Now, the problem is, if you go back to previous wars, like World War II, where 12 million people were in uniform and everybody else was involved, that was natural. Everybody's brother, sister, father, mother was in the service or connected to it, and so it was just comfortable to do that. Nowadays, it's such a small part of our society that most people don't know anyone. Now, they say, thank you for your service. They're very generous with programs, which is deeply appreciated, but the reality is less than 1% of all Americans serve. And so you're just not touched with it as closely. San Antonio more than most places, obviously, but the American people aren't. And so while there's a sense of gratitude, there's not a sense of absolute integration with our veterans. Our veterans are sort of this group, and to be honest, it's pretty inbred now. Our military services are extraordinarily the product of a limited part of the nation which enlists at high rates, and then sons and daughters of veterans. It's extraordinary, the numbers. And that's not healthy. So the community has got, if we think about our nation's military, we ought to be able to look in a mirror and that's what we're seeing. Because it's got to be a reflection of the nation. So we own it. And we got to think that way. So when a veteran comes back, we own them, meaning we're responsible. And it's hard. When a veteran comes back, it's scary. You go off for 4 years or 8 years or 30 years. You come back probably to your hometown. You just missed the last 4, 8, or 30 years. Your peers moved on. You try to step in, but you don't have the same relationships. You don't have the same background. You don't have the same skills that they have developed or connections over many years, so it's intimidating. People will pat you on the back, buy you a beer. That's not what you need. You need to be integrated into networks. We talk about veteran suicide, which is tragic. It's not primarily combat veterans. It's not people with PTSD. In fact, there's no correlation between combat experience and suicide. It's dislocation from family, dislocation from friends. It's a sense of isolation. And that's what I think we have to take ownership of. Thank you. Sir.
Good evening, sir. You talked a little bit about China being one of our biggest threats, specifically economically. One of the tools China's using is their Belt and Road Initiative, which is sweeping across Southeast Asia into the Middle East. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on what the U.S. is missing in its grand strategy in order to leverage the instruments of power to lessen China's impact on everybody in that region.
What's our grand strategy?
That's why I'm asking you, sir.
Then what are we missing? I mean, China has the Belt and Road Initiative, which, if you don't know, is a series of connections across Asia into directing toward Europe. And what it is there's some infrastructure involved, but it's really global economic connections. So you start to get economic pipelines growing, relationships growing. When I was commanding in Afghanistan, there was the Anorak copper mine, very valuable place. We couldn't get an American firm to invest in it because it was an unstable place. The Chinese bought it. Now, they didn't even start mining. They just owned it. And what we needed was people to mine to put money into the economy, but they just owned it because they're playing chess, gobbling up resources, building relationships, getting people indebted to them. So I think that kind of strategy, I think, isn't evident in America. If we have it, it's not clear to all of us. When I talk about compete, I'm not talking about passively. I'm not talking about letting American businesses, good luck, do a good job. I'm talking about a focused American effort to understand if we don't go to compete in the national side in things like education, infrastructure, and in businesses, supporting our businesses to do that, we won't compete with the One Belt, One Road. Even though countries may like us more, China's there, and they're building things. And I think it's really important we think competitively. Maybe it's not shooting war, it's a competitive environment. Yes, thanks so much.
Thank you, sir. Pete Navy.
Hoo-ah. That's a given. Sir.
General, thank you very much for coming to Trinity. My name is Daniel Sandoval. I'm a sophomore here at the school. You mentioned something about the investing in people and investing in the things that will help out society.
Yes,
and my big question to you was, how can we invest, and what would you recommend to the younger generations, the rising leaders, in order to combat the inequality seen in the United States?
Yeah. Now I'm going to give you one person's opinion. You know what we should give people? Nothing. We need to ask things from people. So people say everyone should go to college. I'm all about that. Everybody should serve first, not in the military, in civilian ways. Everybody should invest in the country with their time and effort, and then they should be invested in things like education. I think we need a society that, instead of talking to ourselves and saying, we got screwed, we're not getting this, what we need to do is create opportunity and say, okay, go for it. But we got to create that opportunity, and we're not doing that quite as well as we should. In the information age, inequality is going to increase. Because if you think back 50 or 100 years ago, a person's ability to work was often physically based. Even a leader's ability to lead was based on how many people they could reach, talk to, and influence. In the information age, one really clever person can invent things, reach people, and have disproportionate impact on the economy, and therefore make disproportionate money. And that's just fact. And so we got to temper that a bit. I'm a little bit of a socialist in that way. We got to realize that you've got to give everybody an opportunity to get up, because not everybody's going to get the same chances as other people. But you're also not going to, you don't want to stop that. You don't want to tell entrepreneurs you can't be an entrepreneur because, you know, everybody's got to get exactly the same. But at the same time, we've got to aggressively create opportunity and push people to do it. Push them hard, and I would push all parts of our society. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, General.
Last question. Sir.
Thank you, sir, for being here. My name is Kevin Gawana, former Army Sergeant. I was in Afghanistan as part of ISAF-4,
God
03 and 04. My question, you, in your earlier part of the presentation, you helped me pose my question without trying to give it a larger context. So in view of all the things, the fact that we're going to continue to fight the counter-terrorist wars in Afghanistan or in the Middle East in general, and the fact that Russia, China, and those countries are investing in space and all of these weapon systems, from what you know, is our force structure, particularly the Army, are we in the right place for the force structure, numbers of people, weapons development, and then, just in general, are we in the right place to counteract or be prepared to respond in military ways to all of these factors? Thank you.
The answer is I'm sure we are not, but only because it's almost impossible for the United States to have it right. Because if you think about most nations, think of Israel. They essentially have a single problem: defend Israel. Think of other states. Their problems are narrower, more focused. They can focus what their needs are. We have this huge requirement. We have to defend the United States. We have to work with allies, defend shipping lanes. So we've got this extraordinary breadth of responsibilities from which we profit. I mean, at the end of the day, the globalization and all has disproportionately benefited us. But it makes the military forces have to do everything from very low intensity warfare all the way up to potential nuclear and now high-tech warfare in space and all. So I'm quite sure we have it wrong because it's almost impossible to get it right. What we do have to do, though, I think is, as Lieutenant Colonel asked a question earlier, one of the challenges is when you build, people will obviously build something different from that so that what you built is not now effective. They won't fight that kind of war. So I think we need to create a capability to build very quickly, to iterate very quickly. Some of the things we build are very, very expensive, take a very long time. And the problem is when the war is different from what we expect, if we're stuck with something that isn't right, it's going to be really, really hard to change to that. And the nature of most militaries in history is to try to do what you've done, what you've prepared for. And I think that will hurt us. Now, a lot of our opponents have similar problems. So we can't say that we're the only people with that problem. The other part of it is, if you think technology, back 40, 50 years ago, most technology started in the government and the military and then progressed to the civilian side. Nowadays, it's the opposite. Most technology is developed on the civilian side and then migrates to the military. The problem is that means that as the technology is being developed out here, you've got to be aware of it. You've got to figure out what works because even garage startups are going to figure it out maybe before you do. And so the challenge is you could find yourself easily behind some Gomer, in his basement creating something and selling it to somebody else. That means a different connection with our industrial base than we've had before. And we have sort of an archaic system of acquiring weapons, and we're going to have to, I think we should be pushing to change it. There are people pushing that way, but it's hard. It's a hard move. Okay. Thanks for your service.
Thank you, sir.
This better be great because you're the last question.
Howdy. My name is Jace Woody. I'm a political science major here at Trinity. My question is about I wanted your expertise in or what you think we should do when it comes to the Saudi Arabia-Iran conflict.
Yeah.
We seem to be treating Saudi Arabia as an ally, despite their financial support of Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
Because it seems that we hate Iran so much. I know you briefly mentioned in your speech the oil wars of the area, and I wanted to know how should we be treating Saudi Arabia? Should they be an ally, or should we just let them fight it out? Because at the moment, it seems to be that the current strategy is treat Saudi Arabia as an ally, even give troop support to Saudi Arabia and have Saudi Arabia direct our troops, which it doesn't make any sense to me. I wanted to know if it made any sense to you.
All right, well, that was the last question, so thank you. Yeah, that one's really hard. Here's, I'm gonna give, again, personal response. I think Saudi Arabia is an ally, but it's a problematic ally. I mean, Saudi Arabia has built a relationship to us. It has, at times, constricted oil, 73, 78, but in other times it's ensured the flow of oil, so they were viewed as critical to us. It's not as critical anymore because we don't have that same requirement for that oil. They have worked very hard to maintain good graces, although 15 of the 19 9/11 attackers were Saudis. And so, and they fund, through the Wahhabist movement, they fund an incredible amount of extremism. So I would maintain an allied relationship with Saudi Arabia, but it would be more transactional. I actually think that Saudi Arabia needs to be an ally, but doesn't need to have a blank check with the United States, and they've worked to do it.
So you believe they should be economic allies but not military allies?
Well, no, I think they should be military allies, but what I'm saying is we should be much more demanding of the Saudis than we have been in the past.
And we are currently being now.
Absolutely. And I think that now I could be completely wrong because there's much to be frustrated with the Iranians. I personally fought the Iranians. They've killed my people, we've killed their people. But I think we need to think about a relationship with Iran long-term going forward, and not necessarily adversarial. They're going to be a regional power. They just are. And maybe they should be. And so what we should be thinking about is how do we start to navigate away from an absolutely oppositional relationship? And the problem is the Saudis and the Iranians are at each other's throats, so the degree to which we fall in with just one, we almost guarantee the antipathy of the other. I think we need to be involved there. I think we need to try to pull closer to the Iranians, frustrating as that might be in the near term, and be more transactional with the Saudis.
Stop prostituting our troops to Saudi Arabia.
I can't judge that one because I'm not involved in the decision.
All right. Thank you so
That
much.
was a great question. Thanks so much. Thank you so much.
So join me in giving a round of applause to General McChrystal. Great evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's my honor. Thank you so much.
I'll get our wives and I'll